All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling Harold Arthur Prichard. And, maybe not a household name exactly, but definitely a philosopher who left his mark, especially at Oxford, between the wars.
Yeah, the interwar period at Oxford, just buzzing with philosophical activity, and Prichard right at the center of it, especially with that group, the British intuitionists.
Right, the intuitionists. And, alongside Prichard, you had guys like W.D. Ross, E.F. Carrot.
H.W.B. Joseph, you can't forget Joseph. And even a bit beyond Oxford, you had C.D. Broad and A.C. Ewing over in Cambridge. Kind of their kindred spirits, you could say.
Kindred spirits,
Hmm.
a real movement there. And, what's interesting is that we mainly remember Prichard for his work in ethics, but his first love, philosophically speaking, was epistemology.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, isn't it? He really starts with this deep dive into the theory of knowledge itself. And for us, as philosophers looking back, it's really key to understanding his later work.
Yeah, for sure. Those early epistemological commitments, they really shaped his whole approach to ethics. It's a great example of how different areas of philosophy, they all connect in the end.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't really separate them, can you? The questions about how we know what we know, they inevitably lead to questions about how we know what's right and wrong.
Right. And even before he became this philosophical powerhouse, I mean, Pritchard had a pretty remarkable academic journey.
Hmm.
First-class honors at Oxford, not once, but twice. Math first, then greats. Talk about well-rounded mind.
Oh, absolutely. A double first at Oxford. Not to mention he played tennis for Oxford against Cambridge.
Yeah, the guy was a true Renaissance man. Even worked as a solicitor for a bit before coming back to Oxford for good.
That's right. Ended up teaching at Hertford and then at Trinity College. And ultimately, he became White's professor of moral philosophy. Talk about a trajectory. From math to law to the heights of moral philosophy.
Yeah, a really impressive intellectual foundation. So, in this deep dive, we want to get to the bottom of Pritchard's moral philosophy, his critiques of non-intuitionism, of Kantian ethics, and then, really explore his own view, this intuitionist perspective on what makes something right, on what makes something obligatory.
Yeah, and I think what's crucial here for us as philosophers is understanding his epistemology. It's not just background. It really informs his ethical thought in a deep way.
So let's start with that then, his epistemological roots. Pritchard only published one book in his whole career, Kant's Theory of Knowledge, came out in 1909. As you might guess from the title, it was a pretty strong critique of Kant. And a lot of that came from his teacher, John Cook Wilson.
Yeah, Cook Wilson was a huge influence. And, the central argument in Kant's theory of knowledge is this. Pritchard says knowledge is sui generis, meaning it's its own unique thing. And he says because of that, a theory of knowledge is impossible.
Wait, so he's saying we can't have a theory about how knowledge works.
Well, yeah, in the traditional sense, he's saying knowledge is this basic fundamental thing. Like you can't explain red in terms of something else. You just point to it, right? Same with knowledge.
I see. So knowledge is just its own thing. It's not built out of other simpler parts.
Exactly. And that idea that knowledge is fundamental, that carries over into his ethics. He thinks a traditional philosophical account of moral obligation, trying to derive ought from something non-moral, well, it's just as misguided as trying to come up with a theory for redness.
Interesting. So Cook Wilson, how did his epistemology, his views on knowledge, influence Pritchard?
Well, Cook Wilson was big on the idea that, knowledge has to be about something real, something independent of the knower.
Independent of the knower.
Yeah, like what Kant called things in themselves, not just appearances. Knowledge for them, for Cook, Wilson, and Prichard, it can't be just about how things appear to us, shaped by our minds. It has to be about the real thing, independent of our subjective experience.
And this really led Pritchard to criticize the whole concept of appearances, didn't it? Like the idea that all we know is how things appear to us.
Exactly. Prichard thought this focus on appearances created a problem, this sort of divide between the appearance and the real thing. And then we start worrying, do we ever really know the world as it is or just as it appears?
Classic skeptical worry. But Pritchard had a counter to that, right?
Yes. He pointed out that sometimes how something appears is how it is. And in those cases, the appearance itself is how we know the real thing.
So the appearance isn't always some kind of veil hiding reality. It can actually be reality in a way.
Right. It can be our direct access to the real thing. And this all plays into his critique of sense data theory.
Sense data theory.
Yeah. This was a big idea at the time, with Russell, Moore, and others. They said what we're directly aware of in perception, these are mental things called sense data. They're like the immediate objects of our senses.
Okay, so what was Prichard's issue with that?
Well, his main point was that sense data, they're supposed to be what we directly know in perception. But they're also supposed to depend on our minds. Like, they wouldn't exist if we weren't perceiving them.
So for Prichard, that's a contradiction.
Exactly. Because for him and for Cook-Wilson, knowledge has to be about something independent, something that exists on its own, regardless of whether we're perceiving it or not.
Right. So he's saying if sense data depend on us to exist, they can't be what we know because knowledge is of independent things.
That's the core of his critique. And he even suggested the whole sense data debate was based on a mistake. This mistake of thinking that perceiving, just seeing or hearing something, is already knowing.
I see. So he's separating perception from knowledge.
Exactly. You can see something without necessarily knowing what it is. You can hear a sound without knowing where it's coming from. Perceiving and knowing, they're different.
That's an interesting distinction. And he kept working on these epistemological issues throughout his career, especially in his lectures. I was reading about his, shall we say, unique views on movement and perception.
Oh, yeah. Prichard never shied away from challenging common sense, did he? He famously said that, perceiving something that has duration, like hearing a sound, that's a basic fundamental experience, can't be analyzed further. And his lectures on seeing motion, well, they really got people thinking.
Yeah, like that thought experiment, right, where he asks, what if we see an object moving, but actually we're the ones moving? Could we tell the difference just from the visual information?
Yeah. It's like imagine you're on a train and another train is moving alongside you. Is your train moving or is it the other one? It can be hard to tell just by looking.
Right, exactly. And Prichard used this to push people to think harder about what we actually perceive versus what we infer. And then, of course, there was his claim about motion being absolute, which he declared with his usual firmness.
Oh, yeah. He could be quite direct. I think it's fair to say he wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers. But that was Prichard, wasn't it? Rigorous, demanding, and always willing to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. Despite only publishing that one book, his writing is known for being so clear, really getting to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, he was known for cutting through all the philosophical jargon and getting right to the essence of an argument. He even had this dry wit about it all, like when he said that H.W.B. Joseph's best memorial would be the books his students never wrote.
That's a good one. Very Oxford. And actually, it seems like Prichard himself was a bit hesitant to publish.
Yeah, it's almost like he saw publishing as secondary to the real work of philosophy. The thinking, the debating, the arguing.
Right. It was about that constant engagement with ideas. And he certainly had a big impact on his students and colleagues, even without publishing much.
Oh, absolutely. People like Austin were just in awe of him, considered him one of the sharpest minds at Oxford. Remember the stories about Austin grilling Prichard during his lectures?
Yeah. Austin would just pepper him with questions, apparently even drove Prichard to ask Austin's tutor to intervene.
It just shows how much power Prichard's ideas had. They really sparked debate and made people think hard.
And Broad, another big name in philosophy, he actually called Prichard the Oxford Moor, putting him right up there with G.E. Moore, another giant of the time.
Yeah, high praise indeed. And there's that great story about Prichard completely dismantling T.H. Green's idealism in an exam. Broad said the floor was thoroughly wiped.
Wow. Sounds like Prichard was a force to be reckoned with. And then, of course, there was that famous encounter with Wittgenstein at Oxford. Talk about a meeting of the philosophical titans.
Oh, yeah, that must have been something else. Prichard just grilling Wittgenstein about the cogito, and apparently even mispronouncing his name on purpose.
What a move.
It just shows you he was relentless, He don't care about philosophical reputations. He just wanted to get to the truth.
All right, so we've covered his epistemological roots, his views on knowledge, and we've seen how he approached philosophy in general. Now, let's dive into his moral philosophy, the heart of his work. And he starts with a seemingly simple question. What is an act? What are we actually doing when we act?
Right. And Prichard's answer is that an act is basically the origination of a state of affairs. It's bringing something new into being. You're the agent, and your act causes something to change in the world.
So it's not just thinking about something or wanting something to happen. It's actually making it happen.
Yeah, precisely. And that idea that acts are about bringing about changes in the world, it's really fundamental to his whole ethical system.
Okay, so then what makes an act right or wrong in Prichard's view? What are the conditions for an act to be right?
Well, he says there are two key elements. First, There's the nature of the state of affairs that the act brings about. What is it that you're causing to happen in the world?
Like, is it something good? Is it something bad?
Right. And second, there's this thing he calls a definite relation. It's the relationship the agent has, either to themselves or to others. This relationship is part of the situation, part of what makes the act right or wrong.
So it's not just about the outcome, it's about who you are in relation to that outcome.
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, educating a child, that might generally be a good state of affairs to bring about. But whether you have a duty to do it, whether it's the right thing, that depends on your relationship to that child. Are you the parent? Are you the teacher? A random stranger? It makes a difference.
It's about context, isn't it? The moral context of the action.
Yeah, for sure. And Prichard even extends this to our shared humanity. Like he thinks just being human, being part of the human race, that creates certain obligations. Like we shouldn't intentionally hurt each other's feelings.
Interesting. So he's not saying we should never hurt anyone's feelings, but that we shouldn't do it intentionally.
Right. The intentionality matters. Because there you have a specific relationship, a definite relation, that makes it wrong. And one of Prichard's main targets in ethics is the idea that rightness is all about consequences.
You mean consequentialism, like utilitarianism, where the right action is the one that produces the most happiness.
Exactly. Prichard argues that good consequences, on their own, they're not enough to make an action right. You need that definite relation, too. He gives the example of increasing someone's patience. So more patience, that's a good thing, right?
Sure. Patience is a virtue, they say.
But does that mean you have a duty to make everyone more patient? Does it mean you should go around trying to increase everyone's patience? Prichard says no, it depends on your relationship with that person.
I see. Like if you're a therapist, maybe you have that kind of obligation to your client. But if you're just a random person on the street, it's a different story.
Precisely. The relationship changes the moral landscape. And, when you see this focus on relationships, it's tempting to say, oh, Prichard, he's some kind of agent-relative consequentialist. But actually, the source material is pretty clear that this isn't quite right.
Okay, so why not? Why isn't he an agent-relative consequentialist?
Well, because while Prichard thinks a good outcome is often a necessary condition for obligation, he's very clear that the goodness of the outcome isn't itself the ground of the obligation.
Okay, unpack that for me. What does he mean by that?
Oh, he says, unless the effect of an act were in some way good, there would be no obligation to produce it. So basically, he's saying there has to be some potential good outcome for there to even be an obligation.
Right. If there's no potential good, why would you be obligated to do anything?
Exactly. But he's also adamant that the good outcome by itself doesn't create the obligation. There have to be other factors, specifically that definite relation. The goodness of the outcome isn't enough to generate the ought.
And he's also pretty clear that we don't figure out our obligations by just thinking about consequences.
Right.
Right? He doesn't think it's a matter of calculating what will produce the most good.
Right. He says our sense of obligation, it doesn't come from non-moral reasoning. It's not like figuring out the best way to get to a destination or something. He asks us to think about, when we feel obligated to repay a debt, is that because we calculated the good consequences of doing so?
Yeah, I don't think so. It feels more immediate than that, right?
Exactly. It's a direct feeling of obligation. And Prichard thinks any attempts to derive that feeling from something non-moral, like the goodness of the consequences, is going to fail. It's just not how moral obligation works.
Okay, so he's rejecting this idea that we can somehow move from good to ought.
Yeah.
But what about adding in some kind of extra premise, a hidden assumption that connects them?
Yeah, he addresses that too. He directly challenges this principle, what is good ought to be. He points out that grammatically ought to be sounds weird when we're talking about states of affairs. What makes sense is I ought to do it. You're obligated to act, not just to make something be the case.
That's a subtle point, but I see what he's getting at. It's about agency, about what we ought to do, not just what should be the case in the world.
Exactly. And he uses the example of donating to a hospital. So a well-funded hospital, that's good, right?
Yeah, of course. It helps people.
But does that mean every single person has an obligation to write a letter soliciting donations for that hospital?
I mean, it would be nice if they did, but I don't think that automatically follows, no.
Exactly. The goodness of the outcome, the well-funded hospital, it doesn't create an obligation for every single person to act in that way.
Okay, so Prichard's laid out his view on right action. It's about the state of affairs you bring about, and it's about your relationship to that state of affairs. Now, how does the idea of intuitionism fit into all of this?
Well, Prichard thought that every right act, it falls under some type of action, and all acts of that type, they make a claim on the agent.
A claim, like a demand to do something.
Yeah, basically. But he also recognized that these claims can be overridden. Like one claim might be stronger than another depending on the situation.
So it's not like every situation is totally unique. There are still general principles at work.
Right. He wasn't a particularist like some other intuitionists. But the key thing for Prichard, the defining feature of his intuitionism, is the claim that our understanding of obligation, our sense of rightness, it's
Okay.
absolutely underderivative and immediate, meaning it's a basic fundamental experience. Like seeing the color red, you just see it. You don't infer it from something else.
So we just directly grasp what's right and wrong.
In a way, yeah. He's saying that when we recognize a duty, it's not because we reasoned our way to it from some non-moral facts. It's more like we focus on the non-moral aspects of the situation, the facts, the relationships, and then boom, we just see the obligation.
We have this moral intuition that tells us what we ought to do.
Exactly. And he uses this example of someone who's doubting whether they ought to repay a debt.
Okay, so someone borrowed money and they're not sure if they have to pay it back.
Right. And Prichard says the way to resolve that doubt isn't to do more abstract reasoning. It's to just put yourself in that situation, really imagine it, and let your moral sense do its work.
So it's about experiencing the situation, not just thinking about it abstractly.
Yeah. And when we try to articulate why something is obligatory, like why we have to repay a debt, Prichard thinks this will lead us to a moral principle.
Like I had to repay anything I owe.
Exactly. But if we then ask, well, why that principle? Why is that the rule? Prichard says the principle itself contains its own reason. Like the obligation to repay a debt, when you really grasp it, it's self-evident.
So the justification is built into the principle itself.
Right. And he thinks we often recognize the particular obligation before we even formulate the general principle. Like we feel the pull to repay the debt before we come up with the rule, I ought to repay what I owe.
Interesting. So it's not like we start with the rule and then apply it. It's more like we experience the obligation and then we try to articulate the rule that captures that experience.
Yeah, precisely. And if we had doubts about a moral principle, Prichard says we shouldn't just stare at it and try to reason our way out. We need to go back to those specific situations, imagine them vividly, and see if we still feel the pull of the obligation.
So it's always about going back to the concrete experience of the moral demand.
Exactly. That's where the real moral knowledge lies for Prichard. Now, this brings us to his views on the good, the right, and the obligatory. Like many intuitionists, he was adamant that you can't derive the right from the good.
Meaning you can't just say, this is good, therefore we ought to do it.
Right. And interestingly, he didn't think you could derive the good from the right either.
So they're distinct, independent concepts.
Yeah, for Prichard, they are. He thought goodness is a simple property, a basic feature of things. It can attach to states of affairs, to people, to actions.
Okay, so actions can be good, but what about the motive behind the action? Does that matter for Prichard?
Yeah, he thought the motive is actually crucial. When we say an act is good, we really mean it's done from a good motive. So it's not just about what you do, it's about why you do it.
And he distinguished between the moral motive, like the sense of duty, and other kinds of motives, like desires.
Right. In his early work, he saw them as two different kinds of things that could move us to action. And he also distinguished between the act itself, like the bare fact that you did something, and the action, which includes the motive.
So the action is the act plus the reason behind it.
Exactly. And he thought only the action with its motive could be morally good or bad. The bare act, just doing something, that's not morally valuable on its own.
I see. So like if I help someone across the street, the bare act of helping isn't good or bad. It depends on whether I did it out of duty or because, I don't know, I wanted to impress someone.
Right. The motive makes the difference. And Prichard also rejected this idea of instrumental goodness, the idea that something is good just because it leads to something else that's good.
So something can't be good just because it's useful.
Not for Prichard. Goodness has to be more fundamental than that. Now, when it comes to obligatoriness, that's where things get really interesting. Prichard's views actually changed a lot over time.
Okay, so what was his initial view?
Well, at first he thought obligatoriness, like goodness, was this basic property of acts, and it was separate from goodness. And importantly, the motive didn't matter for whether an act was obligatory or not.
So even if you did something for the wrong reasons, the act itself could still be obligatory.
Yeah, that was his early view. But later, he changed his mind quite dramatically. He came to think that obligatoriness isn't a property of acts, it's a property of agents.
of agents. So it's not about the act itself, but about the person doing the act.
Exactly. He came to think that when we say an act ought to be done, what we really mean is that someone, some agent, ought to do it. It's their duty.
So the focus shifted from the act to the person who has the obligation.
Right. And there were a couple of reasons for this shift. First, he had some epistemological worries, like if acts were made obligatory by objective facts about their consequences, how could we ever know for sure what our obligations are?
Yeah, because it's hard to know all the consequences of our actions beforehand.
Exactly. And Prichard thought it was problematic to say we're obligated to do things based on facts we can't possibly know for sure.
And the second reason for the shift.
It had to do with time. Like, we can feel obligated to do something before we actually do it. So the obligation, it can't be a property of the act itself because the act hasn't happened yet. It has to be a property of the agent, the person who has the obligation.
I see. So the obligation exists before the act, so it can't be attached to the act itself.
Right. And this shift in his thinking about obligation, it has implications for how we think about moral reasoning. Like the common idea that if something will have good consequences, then we ought to do it.
Yeah, that seems pretty intuitive. But Prichard had problems with that, right?
Yeah. Once he saw obligation as a property of the agent, he started questioning these inferences that go from facts about actions to conclusions about what we ought to do. He thought we need to be much more careful about how we make those connections.
Okay, so let's move on to Prichard's critiques of other ethical theories. He was particularly critical of what he called non-intuitionism, and he used the work of Henry Sidgwick as his main example. How did he understand Sidgwick's ethics?
Well, he saw Sidgwick's main point as this, that we ought to aim at certain ends, certain outcomes that are good. So it's all about achieving those good outcomes.
Okay, so that sounds pretty straightforward. What was Prichard's problem with that?
Well, his main objection was this. To aim at something means you're motivated by the desire for that thing. So Sidgwick's whole theory, it rests on the idea that we're obligated to act from a certain motive, the desire for the good.
And Prichard already rejected that, right? The idea that we can be obligated to act from a specific motive.
Exactly. He thought we can't directly control our desires.
Yeah.
We can't just choose to want something. So it doesn't make sense to say we're obligated to act from a desire we might not even have.
And he also had this other point, right, about the connection between aiming at an end and doing the things that will lead to that end.
Yeah, he thought that connection is much more complicated than Sidgwick acknowledged. Like, just because we should aim at some good outcome, it doesn't automatically follow that we have to do every single thing that might contribute to that outcome.
Right. There might be other moral considerations that outweigh that particular action, even if it would ultimately lead to something good.
Exactly. And Prichard suggested that if Sidgwick wanted to base his theory on outcomes, he should have focused on the duty to actually achieve or ensure those outcomes, not just aiming at them.
Okay, so instead of saying we ought to aim at the good, he should have said we ought to make sure the good happens.
Right. But even then, Prichard had problems. Because if you ground that duty in the goodness of the outcomes, you're right back to trying to derive ought from good. And Prichard rejected that move.
And if you ground the duty in the nature of the outcomes themselves,
Yeah.
Prichard thought that just collapses into a form of intuitionism.
Right, because then you're saying there are these basic principles, these rules about what outcomes we have to bring about. And that makes the act of bringing about those outcomes a duty in itself, just because of the kind of outcome it is.
I see. So you're back to this idea that we just directly apprehend certain things as being obligatory, certain actions as being right or wrong.
Exactly. And Prichard's other big target was Kantian ethics. How did he understand Kant, you ask?
Well, he thought Kant's central claim was that an action is only right if it's done from the motive of duty.
Meaning you have to do it because you believe it's your duty, not for any other reason.
Right. And Prichard, he actually agreed that acting from duty is a good thing, maybe even the only way to be truly morally good.
But he still had objections to Kant's theory.
Yeah. His main objection was, again, this idea that we can't have a duty to act from a particular motive. We can't be obligated to feel a certain way.
Right, because we can't directly choose our emotions or motivations.
Exactly. But he also had a more specific critique of Kant. He said that if our only duty is to act from the motive of duty, then no specific act can ever actually be a duty.
Wait, how does that work?
Well, think about it. If the only duty is to act because it's your duty, then what exactly is it that you're obligated to do? The content of the duty, the actual action, it becomes kind of empty.
It's like saying, you have to do something, but I'm not going to tell you what. Right. And Prichard thought this makes Kant's view ultimately incoherent. You can't have a duty to act from duty without also having some specific thing you're duty-bound to do.
And some Kant scholars might say he's misinterpreting Kant, right? That Kant thought moral goodness requires acting from duty, but rightness doesn't.
Yeah, that's a common response. But even if we accept that, Prichard would still point out the fundamental difference in their approaches. Kant gives this elaborate explanation for how actions become duties, with the categorical imperative and all that. But Prichard says we don't need any of that. We just directly apprehend our duties.
There's a clash between two very different ways of thinking about morality.
Yeah, it's a clash between trying to construct morality from rational principles, like Kant does, and just recognizing moral truths directly, like Prichard thinks we do.
All right, so to wrap up, let's talk about the changes in Prichard's own thinking, because he wasn't afraid to revise his views.
Oh, absolutely. He was always refining his ideas, like with the moral motive. At first, he thought conscience, the sense of obligation, was a distinct kind of motive, totally different from desires. But later, he changed his mind.
So what did he come to think?
He decided that all action requires desire. You have to want something to be motivated to act. So the sense of obligation, it's not a motive by itself. It needs a desire to do the right thing to actually make you act.
I see. So it's not enough to just recognize your duty. You also have to want to fulfill it.
Right. And this idea, it actually became quite influential later on, especially for those who thought moral judgments aren't really about truth or falsity, but more about expressing our desires or emotions.
Interesting. And his view on action itself, that also went through some changes, right?
Yeah, he started with this idea of action as consciously bringing about a change. Like you do something and that causes something to happen in the world.
Pretty straightforward.
But then he made this distinction between direct and indirect causation. He said we're mainly obligated to set ourselves to achieve certain outcomes, not to actually achieve them, especially if the outcome is uncertain.
So it's about trying your best,
Yep.
not necessarily guaranteeing a specific result.
Right. And even later, influenced by Cook-Wilson, he moved away from this idea of originating change altogether. He said action is actually about willing a change, and often that means willing a bodily movement.
So instead of focusing on the change in the world, he focused on the internal act of willing.
Yeah. And he had reasons for this. He thought action is a kind of activity, while just causing something that's not necessarily an activity. Like if I accidentally knock over a vase, I caused a change, but I didn't act in the true sense.
So it's about the intentionality of the action.
Right. And he also pointed out that if you try to define willing in terms of willing to will, you get into this infinite regress. It's like, I will to do this, but first I have to will to do it.
Yeah, that gets pretty absurd pretty quickly. And finally, there were his views on obligation itself. We already talked about how he shifted from seeing it as a property of acts to a property of agents.
Right. That was a big one. And for a while, it seems like he tried to distinguish between obligation, which belonged to the agent, and rightness, which might still belong to the act.
But that got messy, right? Because it would mean you could be obligated to do something wrong.
Exactly. And he seems to have abandoned that view fairly quickly.
And his understanding of moral principles also evolved, right?
Yeah, he started with the idea that principles specify all these distinct obligations, but then he realized they could conflict with each other.
So what did he do?
He moved towards a view that's kind of similar to W.D. Ross's idea of prima facie duties. It's the idea that there are these different moral claims on us, different obligations, but they can be overridden in certain situations.
So it's not like there's one absolute rule for every situation.
Right. And Prichard had his own twist on this. He thought each possible action in a situation has its own prima facie ought. Like there's a reason to do it, a claim it makes on you.
But we have to weigh those different claims against each other.
Exactly. And our actual duty, what we most ought to do, that's determined by the balance of those claims.
So it's this complex process of weighing different moral considerations.
Yeah. And that's how Prichard ended up thinking about moral decision-making. So, to sum up, Harold Arthur Prichard,